UFC 271, Israel Adesanya versus Robert Whittaker. Israel Adesanya outclasses Robert Whittaker to retain his middleweight belt. Many fans seem to think that Israel Adesanya actually thoroughly outclassed Robert in that fight, and a lot of them seem to think that anyone who saw the fight going Robert's way is simply delusional, talking about Israel Adesanya's genius fight IQ, or how he walked down Robert all night, or how thinking that Robert had even a chance or a smidgen of hopes of winning would simply be delusion. But I'd like to assess this argument and say, did Israel Adesanya actually outclass Robert Whittaker? Is it delusional to think that Robert Whittaker beat Israel Adesanya? Is it? No. So in this video, I'm just going to show you how close the fight actually was by looking at some perspectives from the fans, from actual other fighters, and by dismissing some of the arguments that I see people use in order to favor Izzy by a clear margin. And so let's get to it. So my first argument is called the split because it talks a bit about the divide between the perspectives that the people saw. On the commentator side, guys like John Anik, Michael Bisping, and Daniel Cormier, they saw the fight leaning towards Izzy and would have given it to Israel. Whereas people like Anthony Smith and Chael Sonnen saw the fight going to Whittaker. Now, of course, there's other fighters that saw it going to Whittaker like Justin Gaethje. And so, just as you can tell right off the bat, the commentators, the fighters are split on who they think won. It kind of shows how really flimsy the victory is on both sides. The argument could have went to either person. So to call someone delusional or to see a clear victory for Israel Adesanya or a clear victory for Robert Whittaker is a bit too harsh. But I also want to bring up the perspective of the fans who were actually watching the fight. Now, if you pay close attention to this footage, in this footage, there is no commentary. There's nothing going on in the background that can kind of skew the perspective of the fans towards either one side or the other. And now, those same fans that had no commentary playing, look at their reaction to the fight.
Champ, another title defense. Was that the fight you expected from Robert Whittaker?
I knew he was going to bring everything.
When Israel Adesanya made his post-fight interview, the fans were booing.
And that's really what was on display in this fight. I thought when the night was over, Robert Whittaker was going to be the world champion. I was sitting with a group of people who unanimously thought Robert Whittaker was going to be the world champion. When the announcement came in, and it wasn't even a split decision, place booed. 15,000 people were booing.
15,000 people, as Chael Sonnen put it, were booing. On the other side, when Robert Whittaker made his speech,
Champ, you can feel the love from the crowd.
the fans were cheering. 15,000 people saw that fight and came out thinking that Robert Whittaker won the fight. So to dismiss pretty much the entire stadium as delusional is a bit of a stupid take, don't you think? Now, could the fans be wrong? They could, but that still doesn't prove that it was a decisive victory by Izzy. I mean, just looking at breakdowns by the Weasle or perspectives from people like the MMA guru who have been watching the UFC and who have been watching MMA for a long time. I mean, the Weasle broke down the fight and he thinks that Robert Whittaker should have actually been the winner. And MMA guru also had the scoring criteria being played out for Robert Whittaker. And these are people who have been watching the fight game for a long time.
Giving Adesanya 10-9, Whittaker 4th round 10-9, and Whittaker 5th round 10-9. So did the judges get the decision correct? Arguably no, but I will say it is not a robbery. Whittaker probably should have won this fight 48-47 against Adesanya. This is one of the closest middleweight fights we've ever seen.
Now there's going to be people who are going to argue for the damage, that Israel had a prettier face. And this argument is a bit dumb because their skin tone is different. Bruising shows up way more subtly on darker skin than it does on lighter skin, and that's just the fact of life. There's different things that I feel like a lot of people are leaving out. They're talking about Izzy's fight IQ being better. And for Robert Whittaker to overcome a 7-inch reach difference and then go on to arguably win the fight, especially when you take into consideration that he won the latter rounds, which is where someone with a higher fight IQ would be better able and better suited at adapting. I guess that kind of speaks a bit to how dumb that take is. Another narrative that I absolutely hate, and I'm going to end the video on this, is the narrative of you don't do enough to beat the champ, you have to decisively beat him.
He did say back here that he did feel he'd done enough to win the title.
You don't do enough to win the title, you take the belt. This is not how this works. Well, I did enough. No.
Now, this narrative is a bit dumb because in today's day and age, especially when legacies are built on that kind of concept of having to decisively beat the champ, a lot of these champions are going to have their results scrutinized by future generations of fans, and a lot of them are probably going to come up short or are going to have their legacies slightly dismissed or looked down upon. If you think that another fighter won, but you say, oh, anyways, he didn't beat the champ decisively, I mean, that kind of leaves the concept of that fighter still being better than the champ, even though the champ retains the title. I think it's one of those monkey's paws, because that statement kind of says to me, you know what, he won the fight, but he didn't win it with a big enough margin to justify taking the belt. And that's kind of undermining yourself as a fighter